In early 2014, Sarah Weber walked through the front door of her home in Massachusetts after a long day at the sports supply company she started with her husband, Paul. They were both avid runners, and they had turned their passion into a business, selling water belts and other sports products online. But owning their company meant the workday was never really done, and so sometimes Sarah's life felt like a three-ring circus. As Sarah took off her jacket, her 3 kids, ages 3, 5, and 7, came running up to her to give her a hug. Sarah liked to get down on her knees and greet all 3 of them at their level, but tonight, the effort made her wince. She'd been feeling so tired lately that she hadn't run in a while, and now, just bending down, she could feel all this strain in her muscles. But she tried not to show her discomfort in front of the kids as she stood back up, and then she made her way into the living room where Paul was watching TV. Sarah gave Paul a kiss, then sank down on the couch next to him. She told him she'd spent the whole day in the warehouse, dealing mostly with administrative tasks. But now that she was sitting down, Sarah realized just how exhausted she actually was. But it made no sense to her. Taking care of orders and inventory could be tiring, but Sarah had never felt this weak after a day's work. She was only 39 years old, but her body felt like lead and her brain felt foggy. She also felt the sense of gloominess that she couldn't quite place. Sarah just felt off in a way that did not seem normal, and these feelings had been going on for a couple of weeks now. Sarah and Paul agreed that whatever was going on with her had to be more than just simple fatigue. So the next morning, Sarah scheduled a doctor's appointment just to be safe. A few days later, Sarah sat on an exam table in her doctor's office. Her muscles still ached and her head was throbbing. Sarah told the doctor that basically she had always been healthy, aside from some mild asthma, which didn't even require medication. She and her husband enjoyed being physically active. Sarah told the doctor that she had never smoked, didn't take drugs, or drink to excess. She admitted that her life was busy, but she loved her business and had fun keeping up with her kids. She couldn't understand why she suddenly felt so tired. Her doctor just smiled at her and said that running a business while raising 3 kids was enough to wear anybody out. Also, he told her that her blood test showed she was slightly anemic, which meant her red blood cells weren't getting enough oxygen to fuel her body's tissues. He said it was very common among young women and it could cause feelings of fatigue and weakness. And so he prescribed her some iron supplements and said that they should quickly help her with her energy levels and overall mood. And so Sarah left the office feeling relieved that she would start feeling better soon. But 2 months later, Sarah was back in her doctor's office. Although she had been taking the iron supplements, she still felt weak. On top of that, she had begun to feel this overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. She'd spent the night before lying in bed and staring at the right side of her abdomen, which felt very strange, almost as if it was too full. After listening to Sarah's symptoms, the doctor reviewed her blood work and said that the medication appeared to have taken care of her anemia. He'd also taken a look at her abdomen, and nothing seemed wrong. However, her mounting anxiety and fatigue were very concerning, and so he wanted to screen her for depression. Sarah felt confused. She was tired and feeling down, but she didn't think she was depressed. However, she still agreed to take the screening. If anything, the screening would give her some peace of mind that she was not depressed. However, to her surprise, the screening did the opposite. It showed that she might actually be experiencing depression. Sarah knew the diagnosis wasn't meant to be a judgment on her as a person, but she still sort of felt like she'd flunked a test. And so she wondered if this meant her physical symptoms were actually just in her head. A month later, in May of 2014, Sarah's husband Paul watched Sarah drag herself into the house after another day's work. She looked weak and thin. It scared Paul to see her this way. Paul knew she had been carefully taking the antidepressant medication for weeks now, but it didn't seem to be helping at all. She'd also begun walking for exercise and doing yoga, but her energy was still very low. Sarah was doing everything the doctor recommended, but her health just wasn't improving. In fact, she had lost an alarming amount of weight. And most days, Paul would wake up in the morning to find Sarah lying beside him, completely exhausted. She told him she basically wasn't sleeping, and when she was sleeping, she'd wake up suddenly drenched in sweat. Paul watched as Sarah moved around the house like a ghost. Their 5- and 7-year-olds were trying to show her the arts and crafts project they'd made at school that day, but Paul could tell Sarah was struggling just to stay focused on them. and so Paul decided he would call a friend who was a doctor. At this point, they just needed more opinions about what was going on here. However, Paul didn't want to alarm Sarah, so he excused himself. He found a quiet spot out in the yard and placed the call. He described Sarah's symptoms to his friend. After a moment, the friend said it sounded like what she was dealing with could be a hormonal issue. He wondered if maybe Sarah had something going on with her thyroid, a gland found in the neck. He explained that thyroid disorders can cause weight loss, sweating, and muscle soreness. And so Paul's friend suggested that Sarah make an appointment with an endocrinologist, a doctor who specializes in hormone disorders. A week later, Paul and Sarah sat together on a park bench, watching their kids climb all over some playground equipment. Sarah had come to meet Paul and the kids after her appointment with the endocrinologist. Paul tried to read his wife's expression, but she just sat there in silence. Finally, after a couple of minutes, she sighed and told him what the endocrinologist had said. The results of her blood tests were normal, and the doctor couldn't find anything wrong with her hormone levels. And so the endocrinologist had told Sarah to try to reduce the stress in her life and maybe take a vacation. And then to Paul's surprise, Sarah just burst out laughing. And then he started laughing along with her. The doctor thought a vacation would help Sarah feel better. It was so absurd, it was funny. But after their laughter died down, a serious expression came over Sarah's face. She told Paul she just didn't understand. She had listened to the doctors and taken her iron supplements and antidepressants, but nothing helped. She was as tired as ever, and her symptoms, that were both physical and mental, were only getting more intense. And it pained Sarah to admit that as a result of that, she was no longer available for her kids. Physically, she was still with them, but mentally, she felt totally checked out. So, after talking it over with Paul, she decided it was time to try a different route. At this point, she was willing to try anything to feel better. A week later, Sarah sat on a comfortable couch inside of a dimly lit room. She could feel a wave of nausea coming over her as the smell of scented candles filled the air. She tried her best to ignore her queasy stomach and focus on her breathing as an alternative medicine practitioner asked her question after question about her lifestyle. And after talking with her for about 30 minutes, the practitioner told Sarah that what she was experiencing was something called adrenal fatigue. Though it's not an officially recognized medical diagnosis, it includes symptoms like tiredness, anxiety, and trouble sleeping, which were all issues Sarah was facing. And so the alternative medicine practitioner recommended that Sarah use some special serums, clean up her diet, and, of course, try to reduce stress. This didn't sound very scientific to Sarah, but again, at this point, she was willing to try anything. So she agreed to give the new lifestyle regimen a try. Several weeks later, in early July of 2014, Sarah stood in front of the stove boiling some pasta. She leaned against the counter to support herself. She had followed the alternative medical practitioner's advice as best as she could, but that hadn't helped either. She'd lost even more weight and felt weaker than ever. Her head ached and she had this cold that she couldn't shake. But Sarah was not about to let her illness, or whatever it was, stop her from living her life. So she was powering through her daily chores, even though she would have much preferred to lie down. Sarah turned the burner down to a simmer, and as she did, she was suddenly seized by this deep cough. She instinctively covered her mouth with a towel, and when she pulled it away, she saw she had coughed up quite a bit of blood. This was new and frightening. Sarah's overwhelming sense of dread immediately returned. Something was wrong with her, and there was no way it was just stress. It was time to go back to her medical doctor and tell him to take her symptoms more seriously. A few days later, Sarah and Paul sat inside of an exam room, reviewing an x-ray of Sarah's chest with their doctor. The doctor pointed to a hazy white patch in the lower area of Sarah's right lung. The doctor said the x-ray showed Sarah had pneumonia, a lung infection that can cause chest pain, cough, and fatigue. He explained that most cases of pneumonia resolve in a matter of weeks, but left untreated, the infection can go on and on. He told Sarah that because most cases of pneumonia are caused by bacteria, he was prescribing her some antibiotics that should knock out the infection. Sarah looked over at her husband, and he looked relieved. And all things considered, Sarah felt relieved too. She'd known plenty of people who had gotten pneumonia and recovered just fine after taking antibiotics. So Sarah got up and thanked her doctor. But as she followed Paul to the car, she couldn't help but wonder. It had been months since she first felt sick. If this was as simple as pneumonia, then why had it taken so long for someone to finally figure it out? A month later, Paul sat with Sarah and the kids in the den playing a board game. Paul was getting more and more worried about his wife. Sarah said she felt a little better after finishing her antibiotics, but she still wasn't her old self, not even close. She was only able to work a few days a week, and she rarely left the house unless it was to go to their office. Just then, Sarah started coughing, and she excused herself to go to the bathroom. A moment later, Paul heard a gagging sound. He rushed to the bathroom, where he found his wife bent over the toilet, and there was red liquid in the bowl. She'd coughed up blood again. Paul sprang into action. He called their neighbors and asked if they could watch the kids for a few hours. He needed to get his wife to the emergency room right away. A few days later, a pulmonologist named Dr. Corbin Moss reviewed the results of a chest CT scan with his new patient, a young mother named Sarah Weber. A pulmonologist is a physician who specializes in the respiratory system. Sarah had been suffering from a cough, fatigue, and weight loss for several months. A chest x-ray had revealed a lesion on her right lung, which her family physician had diagnosed as pneumonia. She had coughed up blood at least twice, and the second time, her husband Paul had rushed her to the emergency room and she'd been referred to Dr. Moss. Today, Sarah sat quietly inside of his office, looking lethargic and very thin. Meanwhile, her husband Paul paced anxiously around the room. Dr. Moss told Sarah and Paul that he had seen many cases of recurrent pneumonia, and while it was certainly possible that that's what Sarah was dealing with, he still wanted to conduct a bronchoscopy to learn more about the suspicious area on her right lung. During this procedure, the doctor would insert a scope down her throat to inspect her airway and lungs, and also collect tiny samples of her tissue to be analyzed in a laboratory. The procedure sounded unpleasant, but Sarah immediately agreed to do it. Dr. Moss nodded and said he'd get it scheduled as soon as possible. Following the bronchoscopy, Sarah and Paul met again with Dr. Moss to review the results. Dr. Moss took a deep breath and pulled the results up on his computer. He told Sarah and Paul that he wished he was misreading the data, but there was no denying it. Sarah's results were definitive. She had lung cancer. Sarah just stared at him. She couldn't believe what she just heard. She was only 39 and had never smoked a cigarette in her whole life. How could she possibly have lung cancer? Sarah barely noticed when Paul put his arms around her, and then somewhere in the distance she could barely hear Dr. Moss's voice. But Sarah made herself tune back in just in time to hear the doctor say the words non-small cell adenocarcinoma, the most common type of lung cancer. But the doctor then also said that at least they had caught this early. But Sarah thought back to her months and months of symptoms, and she wondered how early this really was. The next morning, Sarah rummaged around her closet, trying to decide on an outfit for their son's preschool orientation. It was hard for her to concentrate. As usual, she hadn't slept at all. Her diagnosis was constantly looming over her. It didn't feel real. Nothing did. And yet, here she was, standing in the closet getting dressed. Because even when you got the worst news, life still went on. They were running very late to the orientation. Sarah could hear Paul down the hall trying to get their son ready. She needed to hurry, but her body could only move so fast. Finally, Sarah just grabbed a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. But as she pulled on her jeans, her sight suddenly went blurry. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, hoping that when she opened them, her vision would return to normal. But when she opened her eyes, she was still seeing double. A moment later, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She didn't even notice her husband walk into the closet until she saw him kneeling right beside her. Somehow, she'd ended up curled up on the floor. Sarah told him she couldn't breathe and she could barely see. Plus, she thought she might be having a panic attack. She looked at Paul and she could barely make out his features, but she could hear him shouting for an ambulance into his phone. 3 days later, Sarah lay in a hospital bed trying to read a magazine. It was hard to believe that just 3 days ago she had collapsed like that. She was lucky Paul had been there and called an ambulance. Because it turned out she was not just having a panic attack, she was having a stroke. If she had not gotten emergency help when she did, she could have died. Sarah looked over at the chair beside her hospital bed. Paul had been sitting and sleeping there for the last 72 hours while their kids stayed with relatives. Now, Paul was down the hall meeting with their doctors about her prognosis and treatment plan. Sarah had insisted that they discuss everything without her. She just didn't want to be there. She didn't want to know how long she had left to live or how advanced the cancer was. She knew it was bad. She didn't need to hear anything else, just the treatment plan. They agreed that Paul would tell her once they were alone. Sarah carefully reached over to her bedside table where she had a framed photo of their kids that Paul had brought from home. The kids knew she was sick, but she and Paul had not told them all the details. Sarah wanted to tell them everything, but they were too young for that kind of heartache. While Sarah waited inside her room, Paul spoke to the doctor in his office. The physician said that although Sarah had only just been diagnosed with lung cancer, the cancer had been growing in her body for quite a while. In fact, Sarah's cancer was already at stage 4, which is the most advanced stage. It meant that the disease had spread from her right lung to other parts of her body, specifically her left lung, liver, spine, and hip bones. It also had invaded her brain, which had caused the stroke. The doctor told Paul he wanted to run a few more tests, but Sarah needed to start chemotherapy right away. Her condition was dire, and without treatment, she would only have a very short amount of time to live. Paul felt like the earth was falling out from under him. He fought back tears, but after a few moments, he steadied himself, knowing he would have to face his wife with strength as he shared this news. She would have to start treatment right away. 3 weeks later, Paul climbed the stairs of his house with a glass of water for Sarah. She was back home after undergoing her 3rd chemo treatment. Paul knew the treatment had left his wife with very little hair, and she was now more frail than ever, so he was trying to do everything he could to help her through it. However, when Paul entered the bedroom, he nearly dropped the glass. Sarah was lying on the floor, barely moving. Paul rushed over to her, asking if she needed to go to the hospital. But Sarah just shook her head and said she couldn't take it anymore. Her body was giving up. Paul sat beside her, holding her close. He ran his fingers through the thin remnants of her hair and kissed the top of her head. He could understand why Sarah was ready to give up after all the suffering of the past year, but he simply couldn't let her. He and the kids needed her too much. Paul urged his wife to think of her treatment like a long race. She just needed to keep putting one foot in front of the other. He saw that Sarah's eyes were wet with tears, but she still managed to smile and promised she would keep on fighting. Seeing just a little light in his wife's eyes gave Paul hope, but he knew that she needed more than the care she had gotten up to now. So Paul gave his wife another kiss and helped her to her feet, then he told her he'd be right back. There were calls he wanted to make. That afternoon, Paul tracked down a team of thoracic oncologists, doctors who specialize in the treatment of cancers in the chest area. Paul's doctor friend had told him they were the best of the best, working on cases exactly like Sarah's. 90% of lung cancer victims are current or former smokers, but these doctors focused on the remaining 10% who had never smoked a single cigarette. After Paul presented the facts, the team agreed to take Sarah's case. Several weeks later, Sarah and Paul met with the team of thoracic oncologists. With what they'd discovered, they were actually very hopeful that Sarah's condition could be managed. It would turn out they could pinpoint exactly what had caused her lung cancer. It wasn't smoking, or some kind of toxic exposure, or any external agent. It was caused by something inside her body. Specifically, the doctor said that Sarah had a flaw in her genes known as the ROS1 mutation. ROS1 is a gene that can drive cancer growth by sending abnormal signals to cells, telling them to divide uncontrollably and form tumors. The doctor said this mutation was quite rare. It typically presented in just 1 to 2% of patients with lung cancer. Usually, these were younger people who were light smokers or, like Sarah, had never smoked at all. Now, at first, this was very disheartening for Sarah, but the doctors told her, in a way, she was actually lucky to have this mutation. because ROS1 positive cancers are much more treatable than other forms of lung cancer. Sarah began targeted therapy right away. Her doctors prescribed drugs to specifically block the signals coming from the ROS1 mutation, aiming to slow or stop the cancer's progression. And now, according to her website, Sarah has been cancer-free for at least 3 years. She's returned to running her business with Paul and has also started her own meditation practice. She also offers courses for cancer patients and survivors, teaching them how to find peace and strength throughout the unique challenge of cancer. And that even when things get dark, they are never alone. At about 5 p.m. on November 1st, 1996, 52-year-old Gary Triano stood on the 18th green at the La Paloma Country Club in Tucson, Arizona. Gary crouched down to line up a short putt, while 3 of his friends stood off to the side, giving him a hard time for taking so long. Gary just blocked them out. Almost everywhere else, Gary was known for being loud, impulsive, and never slowing down. But on the golf course, he always felt calm and focused. Gary stood back up and prepared to take the shot. He took a breath, brought his putter back just a little, and swung. His friends shouted like that might knock the ball off course, but Gary watched it roll across the green and drop right into the hole. Gary let out a huge yell and thrust his fist into the air in celebration. He turned to his friends and looked at them like they were crazy to think they could beat him. Gary grabbed the ball out of the hole, slipped his club into his golf bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then followed his friends into the country club bar. It was a few days before Gary's 53rd birthday, and he thought there was no better way to celebrate than with a round of golf and a drink with his friends. But what Gary didn't know was that this golf game was actually part of a bigger plan. Gary's girlfriend had arranged this game with his friends, and she'd gotten some other friends to invite him out to a different bar at 6 p.m., all so she could get Gary's house ready for a huge surprise party she was throwing him later that night. Gary and his friends took a seat at the bar and ordered some drinks. And as they did, they all bragged about the best shots they had made that day. The bartender handed Gary his drink, but before he could take a sip, he heard someone calling Mr. Triano behind him. Gary turned, and he saw a young woman in her mid-20s coming his way, and his face just lit up. It had been years since he had last seen her, but he recognized her immediately. She was one of his daughter's friends from when they were young. Gary stepped away from the bar, and the young woman hugged him like she was hugging her own father. Gary asked how she was doing, and he wanted to know all about her life. The two talked for a few minutes while Gary's friends drank at the bar. They were all very used to hearing somebody call out Gary's name no matter where they went, because it seemed like everybody in Tucson knew him. And in truth, Gary was really well known around the city. He had been a big-time real estate investor, he'd opened casinos, and he'd run businesses in a bunch of different industries. And before he'd gotten divorced from his second wife, a socialite named Pamela Phillips, they ran in the same circles as Hollywood celebrities and well-known politicians. The young woman hugged Gary again and said how great it was to see him, and she went outside as Gary made his way back to the bar. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 5:30, and so it was just about time for him to head to the next bar to meet his other group of friends. So he threw back his drink and then reached into his pocket, pulled out several bills, and carefully folded them into little origami flowers. He put these flowers on the bar for a tip, then grabbed his golf bag, shouted goodbye to everyone, and walked out. Gary's friends waved him off and then just kind of shook their heads. Gary couldn't help himself. He always had to make a grand exit. The sun was setting when Gary stepped outside, and so he looked out at the pink and red sky over the mountains and desert in the distance. It was a beautiful day, just about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and Gary smiled. It was perfect days like this that had helped the Tucson real estate market boom, and Tucson real estate had once made him millions of dollars. But now, standing there, thinking about his money, all he could do was laugh, or he'd just get depressed. Despite the continued growth of the real estate market, the last few years had been tough on Gary financially. He had spread himself too thin, investing in too many high-risk ventures, and some of the deals he'd made had completely fallen apart and cost him a huge chunk of his fortune. In order to deal with these massive losses, Gary had recently filed for bankruptcy, and now he was slowly trying to rebuild his wealth. But Gary quickly shook all of this off. From the time he was a young man, he had really believed that no matter what happened to him, he would always land on his feet. And even though he was not making the kind of money he'd made in the past, and his life wasn't as exciting as it was when he and his socialite ex-wife were hanging out with famous people, Gary still just loved being here in Tucson. He traveled all over and gone to lavish parties in some of the biggest cities in the world. But at the end of the day, nothing could beat a perfect Arizona sunset over the mountains and the desert. Gary walked across the country club parking lot to his 1989 Lincoln Town Car. He tossed his golf bag in the back and got into the driver's seat. He was about to take off when something caught his eye. There was a small wooden box in the floorboard of the passenger seat. His girlfriend must have gotten him an early birthday present and somehow hidden it in the car without him noticing until now. Gary smiled, reached down, and grabbed the box. As Gary was getting into his car, the bar inside the country club was getting louder. More people had just come in from the golf course, and everybody was talking and laughing. But suddenly, a huge bang echoed over all that noise. The glasses behind the bar rattled, and some people hit the floor, trying to take cover. They had no idea what was happening. A nearby transformer might have blown, or they could be in the middle of an earthquake. Nobody knew. But one man at the bar, who happened to be a doctor, took off running towards the parking lot, and Gary's friends and some others followed. And when they got outside, they felt like they had just stepped into a war zone. Car alarms blared, they saw smoke rising into the air, they saw cars with shattered windshields, and they saw a Lincoln Town Car with its windows blown out, its doors shredded, and its roof completely ripped off. The doctor ran right to that car, hoping that nobody was inside. But as he got closer, he could see a man sprawled out in the front seat, and most of this man's clothes had been torn off his body, and he looked burned and bloody. The doctor turned around and shouted for the people who had followed him to call 911 and to stay back. He didn't know if they were all still in danger, and even if they weren't, he didn't want anyone to see what he was looking at inside of that car. The doctor leaned in through the space where the car window used to be. He reached down and grabbed the man's bloody wrist. The explosion that had shaken the bar inside must have killed this man instantly. Detective James Gamber of the Pima County Sheriff's Department was clearing the dinner table and putting dishes in the sink at his house when his phone rang. He walked across the kitchen and answered it. It was one of his colleagues from the Sheriff's Department, and this colleague said that there had just been an explosion at La Paloma Country Club, and Gamber needed to get down there right away. So Detective Gamber ran out to his car and sped off through his residential neighborhood. Gamber had only been a homicide detective with the Sheriff's Department for a short time. In fact, he had only worked one homicide case at this point. But as he drove to the country club, he had no idea if he was even heading to the scene of a murder. For all he knew, the explosion he was racing towards could have been caused by an accident of some kind. A few minutes later, Gamber pulled into the La Paloma parking lot, and he saw first responders everywhere. He also saw a different group of people, many of them in golf clothes, standing with two police officers near the main entrance of the club. The detective got out and walked over towards the first responders, and as he did, the scene in the parking lot almost didn't seem real to him. He stepped over shattered glass, and he thought he saw a car windshield stuck up in a tree, and when Gamber got to the car where the majority of first responders were and he looked inside of it, he knew he was not dealing with an accident. There was no doubt in his mind that a bomb had gone off in that car. Gamber stared down at the mangled body in the front seat. He glanced over at the first responders, and even they looked completely shaken. They had seen people who had been pulled from fires, but none of them had seen a man who had been killed by a bomb. The detective looked back at the body, and he saw something that just seemed odd. It looked like this man's clothes had been ripped off by the sheer force of the blast, but his watch had stayed on his wrist. So Gamber leaned further into the car to get a better look. The glass on the man's watch had cracked, and the watch had stopped at 5:38. And Gamber couldn't really explain it, but seeing the watch really hit him hard. It was like this man's last moment on Earth was frozen in time. Gamber stepped away from the car and walked over to the crowd of people standing out front. He briefly spoke to the other officers, and then he started taking statements from everyone. And almost all of them knew the dead man in the car, and they said his name was Gary Triano. Detective Gamber continued to gather information on Gary from the people at the club, and he learned a little about Gary's current girlfriend and what people called Gary's larger-than-life attitude. As Gamber wrote everything down in his notebook, he heard sirens blaring and cars and vans speeding down the street towards the parking lot. He He looked out onto the street, and he quickly realized this case was about to get a lot bigger than anything he'd ever worked on. Because most of the vehicles heading this way did not belong to the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the local police. They belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And within minutes, Gamber watched as federal agents from the FBI and ATF swarmed the parking lot and took control of the crime scene. After Gamber finished his interviews, he walked away from the club entrance, but he hung back and just watched the activity in the parking lot. This crime scene had overwhelmed him when he arrived, and now there were law enforcement officers from multiple agencies searching the lot, and forensics and explosives experts from the ATF and FBI searching Gary's car. Gamber honestly wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Finally, amidst all of this, he spotted his boss, the Pima County Sheriff. So he weaved his way past federal agents towards Gary's car and approached the sheriff, who looked kind of overwhelmed himself. The sheriff told Gamber that several of the federal agents he'd spoken to thought there was a chance that this had been a professional mob hit. Technicians had already found fragments in and around the car that they believed were from a homemade incendiary device, and they thought this device could be the type of bomb often used by the mafia. This actually all made sense to Detective Gamber because he knew that the mafia had been prevalent in this area since back in the 1970s. But Gamber wanted to know what their department's role was in all of this. Clearly, the FBI and ATF were running things here, and if the mafia was involved, both of those agencies would probably run the entire case for a while. The sheriff said their department would coordinate with the feds, but he told Gamber that it was still the homicide unit's job to pursue this like they would any other murder case. So Gamber told his boss if the FBI and ATF were going to start looking into big-time suspects like organized crime families, then he wanted to start on a much smaller scale. And right now, that meant talking to the person who would almost always be the first suspect in a murder investigation, the victim's romantic partner. A little over an hour after the explosion, a woman stepped out of her car and approached the country club parking lot. She looked almost like she was sleepwalking, like she didn't see all the chaos around her. Local police officers immediately stopped the woman from walking any further into the parking lot, and she shouted that she was Gary's girlfriend. Detective Gamber saw this happening. He'd been waiting for her. A police officer had called her at Gary's house to inform her about what had happened. At first, she didn't believe the cop. She said Gary was out with his friends, and then he was going to come home for a huge surprise party she was throwing him. But eventually, she had accepted the truth, and she said she was coming to the country club right away. Gamber rushed over to her and introduced himself. He said how sorry he was, and he hated to put her in this position right now, but he needed to ask her some questions. Gary's girlfriend looked back at him, still with this glazed expression, and said she would try to help. Gamber glanced down at a few notes he'd scribbled in his notebook. He knew the doors on Gary's car had been so badly damaged by the blast that it was impossible to tell if someone had broken into the car to plant the bomb. But people had been in and out of the parking lot all day, and so far, nobody had reported witnessing a break-in. So, Gamber thought there was a good chance that whoever planted the bomb had easy access to Gary's car, so he asked Gary's girlfriend if she had keys to the Lincoln. She said she did, but she said it didn't really make a difference because Gary always left his car unlocked. This threw Gamber off. Somebody leaving their car unlocked, especially a nice car like Gary's, sounded like something that only happened back in the 1950s. But Gary's girlfriend said that he had this foolish belief that nothing bad would ever happen to him, and that people were actually good at heart. She said if it wasn't for her, he very likely would have just left his house unlocked every night. Gamber continued to talk to Gary's girlfriend for a few more minutes. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but this woman really did seem completely shocked by Gary's death. So he told her before he let her go that he just wanted to know if she could think of anyone in Gary's life who might have wanted to harm him. Gary's girlfriend shook her head. She said Gary had a good relationship with both of his ex-wives and his 2 grown children from his first marriage, and the children from his second marriage were still pretty little, and she said everybody who knew Gary loved him. He was generous and fun. Suddenly, Gary's girlfriend trailed off, and the look on her face totally changed, like she had just thought of something. Gamber asked if something was wrong, and she nodded. There was one past relationship in Gary's life that had ended badly, and it just continued to get worse. She said Gary had an ex-girlfriend named Robin Gardner. and Gary had left her when she got pregnant. But even before that, Gary had wanted to get out of the relationship because Robin had a temper and had once attacked him with a flower vase. Gamber asked if Gary had had any contact with Robin lately. Gary's girlfriend said that Robin had called a few months earlier, and she left Gary a message on the machine. And all Robin had said was, "You're going to pay. Someday, you're going to pay." The day following the bombing, FBI and ATF agents remained focused on possible mob ties to Gary's murder, while Detective Gamber drove to meet Gary's ex-girlfriend, Robin, at her house. By this time, the bombing was all over the news in the region, so Robin was well aware that Gary had died. Robin opened the door, holding her baby girl in her arms, and she led the detective into the kitchen, where her new husband was already sitting at the table. Gamber took a seat, and he didn't waste any time. He said he knew that Robin had once physically assaulted Gary because Gary had called 911 and asked police to remove her from his house. Gamber also knew about the threatening phone message she had left him. Robin's face immediately turned red, and she looked very embarrassed. She said she couldn't justify her actions, but Gamber clearly did not have the full story. When she had gotten pregnant, Gary had openly doubted that the baby was his. He broke up with her and didn't want any responsibility for the child, so she lashed out because she was hurt and scared and didn't know if she'd be able to provide for her baby on her own. But after the baby was born and a paternity test proved that she was Gary's daughter, Gary had said he would help take care of her financially, and Robin and Gary's relationship became a lot more civil. The baby started crying a little, and Robin asked if she could excuse herself. Gamber said of course, and Robin carried the baby out of the kitchen. Her husband watched to make sure she was out of earshot, and then he leaned toward Gamber and spoke quietly. He said there was no doubt that his wife had a temper. If Robin was mad, she made it really clear. But despite the issues she'd had with Gary, Robin's husband said that she told him that Gary was a good man for admitting he was wrong and doing his part to make sure the baby was taken care of. By the time Gamber left the house, he didn't feel like Gary's ex-girlfriend or his latest girlfriend were the likely killers. He didn't want to eliminate any suspects until he had more clear evidence, but he knew Gary's ex-wives and his grown children could also have a motive to kill Gary. And all of them most likely knew about Gary's strange habit of keeping his car doors unlocked, so they would know how easy it would be to place a bomb in the Lincoln town car. During the week following the bombing, Detective Gamber checked in often with the sheriff and with the FBI and ATF. The feds were still tracking leads connected to the mafia, and they were delving deep into Gary's financial records. It had become clear that Gary had racked up millions of dollars in debt, and he owed people money all over the world, so they were even following international leads. But all of the agencies believed Detective Gamber's investigation held just as much weight as theirs. It was still entirely possible that Gary's murder was personal and had nothing to do with his business dealings. So Gamber arranged separate interviews with Gary's two ex-wives, but both of these meetings played out almost exactly the same way. All Gary's first wife, Mary, and his second wife, the socialite Pamela, really told Gamber was that they loved Gary, thought he was a great father, and they had remained good friends with him after their divorces. They were also both heartbroken by Gary's death. After meeting Mary and Pamela, Detective Gamber did not feel like he had any new information about the case, and he was already starting to get frustrated. Gary's somewhat tangled romantic life had seemed like a strong lead, but his relationships with his ex-wives appeared to have both been pretty healthy. And even as Gary had started to struggle financially, he always paid his child support, so that was not a cause for conflict. And Gamber also had to admit that both women had really solid alibis. Neither of them had been in town when Gary died. Following the meetings with the ex-wives, Gamber interviewed Gary's son and daughter from his first marriage, who were both in their mid-20s, and he hoped they would give him something to go on. But they would both say that Gary was a great dad and an amazing friend. He meant everything to them. They admitted that when they were teenagers and their parents got divorced, they had blamed their dad at first, but they ended up loving their stepmom and their two little half-siblings, so any animosity they felt towards their dad had disappeared. And so in about the span of a week, Gamber had met with the people he believed had the clearest personal motives to kill Gary, but he felt like he still hadn't gotten anywhere. At the same time, the federal investigations also seemed to be stalling. There were plenty of leads, but each one of them fell apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny. So, as November came to an end, everyone involved in the hunt for Gary's killer worried that the case was already drying up, and that the killer, who had set off a homemade bomb in the city of Tucson, would remain free and out on the streets. In early December, about a month after Gary's murder, Detective Gamber got a phone call at his desk, and as soon as the man on the line began talking, Gamber could hear the urgency in his voice. The man said he was an investigator from Aspen, Colorado. He'd just seen a news report about Gamber's ongoing investigation, and he had some strange pieces of evidence that he thought might be connected to the car bombing. When Gamber heard this, he felt like he'd just woken up after a long night of sleep. This was the first time he'd been excited about this case in weeks. The Colorado investigator said he'd been working a fraud case for months, trying to track down a man named Ron Young. Ron had bilked a bunch of people out of thousands of dollars. And back in October, this investigator had found an abandoned minivan in California that Ron had rented. Inside the van, the investigator said he'd found a sawed-off shotgun. He'd also found some potential evidence that he didn't really understand at the time. But after seeing the news report about this car bombing, he thought that evidence he found might finally make sense. Gamber was now standing up at his desk, just waiting with anticipation to hear what this evidence was. The investigator said he had found a map of Tucson, Arizona, and a piece of paper with some names on it. And one of those names was Gary Triano. Gamber felt his hands shaking. He wanted to run out of the station and go find Ron Young right away. So he asked the investigator to please send over all the information he had on him. The investigator said he would do that as soon as they hung up, but he gave Gamber a warning. He said Ron was elusive, and tracking him down would not be easy. Throughout the end of 1996 and the first several months of 1997, Detective Gamber worked with the FBI to try to locate Ron. But after months of searching, Gamber started to feel like the investigator from Colorado had made a huge understatement. Ron was not just elusive, this man was a ghost. None of Ron's family or friends, or anyone he knew, seemed to have any idea where he was. He might as well have just dropped off the face of the earth. And even with Gamber and the FBI coordinating with state and local authorities across the country, they could not get a viable lead on Ron's location. During this time, the other aspects of the investigation had also hit a wall, and so even the federal agencies believed that finding Ron was their only real option for keeping the case going. But as more time went by and they still could not find Ron, Gamber started to get this sick feeling that Gary's killer would never be found and his family would never get closure. And for Gamber, who was still so new to the homicide unit, this felt like a total failure. And by early summer of 1997, about 7 months after Gary's murder, there was still no sign of Ron. And Detective Gamber's fears came true. The interagency task force that had been working on the case disbanded. The feds left, and Gary's murder was no longer considered a top priority for the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Gamber did his best to try to return to the case files whenever he could, but he soon had other homicide investigations to lead. And then Gary's murder almost completely disappeared from the news, and the case went cold for a very long time. On November 19, 2005, 9 years after Gary's murder, a chiropractor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, came home after a day of work, sat down on his couch, and turned on one of his favorite TV shows, America's Most Wanted. At the time, America's Most Wanted was a very popular show that featured stories about criminals who were still at large, in the hope that the viewers of the show might provide tips that could help lead to an arrest. The chiropractor watched the show and listened to a story about a man who was wanted in a fraud case and had possible connections to a murder. And as the chiropractor watched, he suddenly got off the couch and got closer to his TV to make sure he was really seeing what he thought he was seeing. There was an image of the criminal on the screen. Now, the chiropractor didn't recognize the criminal's name, Ron Young, but he definitely recognized the man, because he had treated this man's bad back on several different occasions. The chiropractor grabbed his cell phone from his pocket and dialed the number for the America's Most Wanted tip line. 2 days later, federal and local law enforcement arrested Ron Young in Fort Lauderdale. And days after that, Detective Gamber, who was still a homicide detective, along with other Pima County investigators, flew to Florida to question Ron in connection to the bombing that killed Gary Triano. Detective Gamber felt exhilarated to have the case reopened. He had always regretted that he had not been able to bring Gary's killer to justice, but Gamber would soon realize that he still had a long way to go. Ron repeatedly denied having anything to do with Gary's murder, no matter how much police pressured him. And so it would take several more years of coordinated efforts between law enforcement organizations across the country and multiple international agencies for investigators to gather evidence to prove that Ron knew a lot more than he was willing to say, and that there was someone else out there on the run who was directly connected to Gary's murder. 4 years later, on a cold December night in Vienna, Austria in 2009, now 13 years after Gary's murder, members of Austria's federal police force approached an upscale hotel located in one of the wealthiest parts of the city. The lead officer and his partner found the room they were looking for and knocked on the door. When the door opened, the lead officer spoke in German, but the person at the door looked confused. So the officer quickly switched to English and asked them to identify themselves. And when the lead officer heard this person's name, he told them that they were under arrest for the murder of Gary Triano. Soon after this arrest, the lead officer contacted his supervisor, who then got in touch with federal authorities in the United States to start the extradition process. That process took months, but when the suspect was back in Arizona, Detective Gamber interviewed them. And by the time that interview ended, all of Gamber's hard work had finally paid off. After 13 years, he now knew who had murdered Gary. Based on evidence collected over the course of the entire investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Gary on November 1st, 1996. At around 4:15 p.m. that day, the bomber sat at a small table in a hotel room, breathing in slowly over and over until they could feel their heart rate slowing down. When they felt completely calm, they reached out, picked up the homemade bomb they had spent days putting together, and then slowly placed it into an open wooden box laying on the table. They secured the bomb inside the box and then walked across the room and grabbed the phone. They took a small piece of paper out of their pocket with a number scrawled on it and dialed. A friendly young man at the front desk of the La Paloma Country Club answered and asked how he could help. The bomber, using an equally friendly voice, asked the young man if Gary Triano was out on the golf course. The young man said he was. He said he had welcomed Gary into the club a little while earlier. After that, the bomber hung up the phone and walked back to the table, picked up the box with the bomb in it, and walked out to their car. They set the box in the passenger seat and then drove slowly down the road. No need to take any stupid chances by driving fast. A few minutes later, the bomber pulled into the La Paloma parking lot. They spotted Gary's Lincoln Town Car and pulled into a spot that was as far away as they could get while still maintaining a clear view of Gary's car. The bomber scanned the lot and they didn't see anyone. So they opened their car door, went around to the other side, and carefully picked up the box with the bomb inside of it. They kept their head down as they walked to Gary's car. When they got there, they saw that the passenger side door was unlocked. They opened the door, crouched down, and placed the box on the floorboard. The bomber closed Gary's car door and quickly walked back to their car and climbed inside. And then they watched and waited. At around 5:30 p.m., they saw Gary step out of the country club. The bomber reached into their pocket and slipped out a small remote control. As they watched Gary get closer to his car, their heartbeat got faster. Gary climbed into his car, and after a second, the bomber watched as Gary leaned down towards the floorboard. And at that moment, the bomber hit a button on that remote. The bomber heard a loud bang and saw the roof of Gary's car go flying into the air. In the chaos, the bomber sped out of the parking lot and drove to a nearby payphone. They dropped a coin in, and when the person answered, the bomber said the job was done. The person on the other side of the call didn't say anything. They just hung up the phone and smiled at their two little children who were playing nearby. Ron Young, the man who had eluded authorities for years before getting caught by a chiropractor watching TV, built the bomb and placed it inside of Gary's car. But Ron was not the person who had set any of this in motion. Gary's second wife, the socialite Pamela Phillips, was the one behind everything. It turned out that despite what Pamela had told the police, she was not happy about her relationship with her ex-husband. Because ever since Gary had begun experiencing financial difficulties, he stopped giving Pamela the type of money he had given her in the past. Gary still paid child support and alimony, but there was nothing extra for her like there used to be. And so Pamela had decided that the only way she could get the kind of money from Gary that she wanted was by killing him. Because Gary had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy, and he had made Pamela and his 2 kids the beneficiaries. But until those kids turned 18, Pamela would receive the payout if Gary died, with the understanding that she would manage and invest the money for the kids. But Pamela just wanted the money for herself and did not want to wait any longer. So she offered a man she'd once had a romantic relationship with, Ron Young, $400,000 to do the job. Ron already had a criminal past, and he had some experience with explosives. So together, Pamela and Ron started planning Gary's murder, and they decided to use a homemade bomb. And in the fall of 1996, they found the perfect way to carry out their plan. Gary's girlfriend had wanted everyone in Gary's family to come to the surprise party she was planning. So she had invited Pamela and the kids, and even told Pamela her plan to keep Gary out of the house. He was going to play golf at La Paloma until around 5:30, and then go to another bar before coming home. So Pamela now had the perfect time and place for Ron to pull off the murder. She knew exactly where Gary was going to be, and she knew Gary never locked his car doors, so Ron would have no problem finding the car and planting the bomb. This all took years for Detective Gamber and investigators to put together, mainly because Ron had been so difficult to hunt down and to get any information from. But when they finally had him in custody and started getting closer to connecting Pamela to the murder, she took off to Europe. It took a while, but eventually, law enforcement agencies in Austria found her staying at a high-end hotel in Vienna. So they arrested her and sent her back to the United States. Ron Young and Pamela Phillips were both found guilty of murder and conspiracy. Ron received 2 life sentences without possibility of parole. Pamela received life in prison plus 25 years, also with no possibility of parole. And because of the amount of time this investigation took, it was both Detective Gamber's second homicide case and his last. He retired from the force not long after having helped solve Gary's murder. In October of 2007, Helena Carroll and her fiancé John Cullen had saved a little bit of money, and they were torn on what to do with it. They knew they should put it aside and put it towards a down payment on a new house, but they also really wanted to go on vacation, and lately life had been very stressful for both of them, and so ultimately they decided, let's just blow it all on an amazing vacation. And so later that month, they flew off to Thailand. Over the course of their week, they spent most of their time at their resort, sitting in the pool and eating nice food, and they were having this really nice time. And on their last day, they decided they needed to do something a little bit more adventurous. And so they decided to explore the Nam Talu cave inside of the Khao Sok National Park, which is this 160 million year old rainforest that was not that close to their resort. In fact, it was not really a huge tourist destination because of how cumbersome it was to get there. But from everything they read about this park and specifically this cave they wanted to go in, it was just this breathtaking experience, and so they were sold. After signing up for a guided tour, they headed down to the pier where they boarded a boat and drove 90 minutes to the entrance of this park. When they got off, they met their 2 guides and then walked down to this entrance area where they connected with the other 5 tourists that were going to be on this tour with them. Those 5 people were 2 Swiss parents and their 2 teenage daughters, along with a 10-year-old German boy who was there on his own. After everyone had said hello and introduced themselves, they began walking through the park towards this cave. The allure of the Nam Talu cave, which is the cave they were going to be going to, was there was a river that ran through it where at times as you walked through this cave, you'd have to hold onto a rope and wade through the water where the water was up to your waist or even up to your neck at times. But it felt safe and controlled, and it was kind of exhilarating for foreign tourists to go through the cave. As they were just about to get to the entrance of the Nam Talu cave, some park rangers happened to walk down the path next to them, and they exchanged some words with the 2 local guides that were leading this tour, and they told them it's a bad idea to go into the Nam Talu cave because this is the monsoon season. No one's supposed to be in there, and if it starts raining while you're inside the cave, you won't hear it, and it will flood the cave, and then you'll be trapped. But despite the warning, the group continued on because it hadn't rained that day, and there wasn't any rain in the forecast. And the 2 local guides that were leading this tour were really confident that they were not in danger. They entered the cave a little after 1 p.m., and right away they were walking through little puddles of water that got a little bit deeper, and pretty soon they were holding onto the rope and walking through the deeper sections of the cave. Water's up to their waist, and by all accounts, it was very exciting. And the entirety of the tour should only take about an hour, where it's 30 minutes in, you hit the turnaround point, and you come back. And they had made it about 20 to 25 minutes in, right before the turnaround point, when Helena and John, who were towards the front of the tour group, heard what sounded like a rushing or roaring sound coming from the entrance of the cave. And they turned around and they saw this wave of water barreling into the cave. And instinctively, John and Helena start climbing up the walls. And luckily, there was a ledge where they were, and they managed to scramble up onto this ledge. And Helena would say, as soon as she got up there, she turned around to look where she had just been standing, right as this surge of water blasted past them, carrying with it the 2 tour guides and the 10-year-old German boy, who immediately got swept around the corner down the dark tunnel. And then seconds later, the 2 Swiss parents and their teenage daughter, they got swept away around the corner. The couple was now stranded on this ledge with no time to be upset about what they're witnessing, because the water was not only surging past them, it was rising, and there was limited amount of space before they would just be completely submerged in water. And so they tried their best to climb up this wall to a slightly higher ledge, which was still only a few feet away from these rushing rapids. And so as they're crouched up on this ledge, John eventually says to Helena, we're going to die if we stay here. We're going to drown. And so I need to find a way to maybe get past this initial rush of water, and maybe on the far side of the cave, I can work my way back up to the entrance and hopefully get us some help. And initially Helena said, don't do it, don't leave, we're safe here. But eventually he said to her, I have to go. I love you, I have to go. And she said, okay. And he jumped into the water, and almost immediately he was pulled under and disappeared. For the next 20 hours, Helena had to sit on this ledge in total darkness until the water finally began to subside a little bit and rescuers could come in to get her. What had happened was, after Helena and the rest of the tour group had gone inside of the cave, they made it just far enough in that they were out of earshot of what was happening outside of the cave. Right at that moment, a huge freak storm rolled in. There was this flash flood that was so intense, the lake that was right outside of the entrance to this cave, it rose up and began dumping directly into the cave. It was like a dam basically breaking, and all the water just poured in all at once. When Helena was finally let out of the cave, she didn't know what happened to her fiance or the other tourists that were part of the group. But as soon as she stepped outside, she saw there were 8 coffins that had been lined up right outside, and she found out that she was the sole survivor. Despite this tragedy, people still go into the Nam Talu cave even during monsoon season. Our next story is called Stowaway. In 1970, 14-year-old Keith Sapsford was living in Sydney, Australia with his parents, and he was desperate to travel the world. His parents wanted him to be able to travel, they just lacked the resources to be able to afford that kind of thing. However, they were able to pull a little bit of cash, and the 3 of them did go on a nice European vacation that his parents were hoping would kind of calm down his desires to want to travel all the time. They thought this would be, a taste before he got older and he could go travel as much as he wanted. But when he came back from that vacation, it really had the opposite effect. It was like Keith had experienced the life that he so desperately wanted, and now he's home, and it's like that life has been taken from him. Following that vacation, Keith began trying to run away from home. Not because he didn't want to be around his parents, but just because he saw it as his only way to, see the world. But every time he would run away, his parents would quickly find him and bring him back home. Their concern for their son would only grow, though, because he would find ways to sneak away and be gone for longer and longer stretches of time, and they're thinking it's only a matter of time before he really gets hurt. In an effort to save their son, they ended up enrolling him in this very strict boarding school that was for boys with behavioral problems. And they were hoping that the staff at the school was going to be able to kind of calm their son down and keep him from trying to run away all the time. But unfortunately, the school really had the opposite effect, because the school, in a sense, was like a prison. You weren't allowed to leave. And so immediately, Keith, when he gets there, he's looking for ways to escape this boarding school. And 2 weeks after arriving, he would be successful. He would elude the staff and he would escape. 3 days after he had escaped this boarding school, he found his way to the Sydney airport. Now, this is the 1970s, and it was far easier to get into an airport than it would be today, where there's lots of security. There wasn't much of that at the time that Keith was at the airport. And so Keith walked across the tarmac to a plane that was bound for Tokyo, and he climbed inside the wheel well. He tucked himself in there, and he waited for takeoff. A photographer named John Gilpin happened to be at the Sydney airport on the same day that Keith is now snuck into that wheel well, and he had a new lens for his camera that he was testing out. And at one point, he was just taking pictures of the tarmac, and he began taking pictures of a plane that was taking off, and it was the same plane that Keith had snuck into. And he takes pictures of it as it takes off, it goes up to altitude, and it flies away. And he just took a series of pictures of it, puts his camera away, doesn't think twice about it. John had inadvertently captured the final moments of Keith as he fell nearly 200 feet to his death. As soon as the pilot took off, the wheels were retracted, opening up that wheel well for a brief second, and there was nothing for Keith to hold on to, and he slipped out. But even if he had not fallen out, he almost certainly would have died from freezing temperatures and lack of oxygen at altitude. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Path Less Traveled. On a spring morning in 1870, a gold prospector named Frank Lemon rode his horse along the shore of the North Saskatchewan River, which is a river that runs through Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada. Frank was at the back of a line of about a dozen men who had all been hired by a rich investor named Lafayette French. He had commissioned them to search the Canadian wilderness for potential gold mines. And if they found a gold mine, then French would bankroll a full-scale mining operation and pull out all the gold he could, and these men who found it would get a cut of the profits. When Frank had signed up for this job, he had thought it was a great opportunity. In fact, he thought it was such a big opportunity that he had convinced his best friend, whose nickname was Blackjack, to come along as well. But now, after weeks of searching the wilderness for these mines and not finding any, all Frank really wanted to do now was just go home. And so as this group of men continued their ride along the shore, Frank sort of zoned out and just kind of stared off into the forest all around him. And then at some point, as he was doing this, as he was looking off to his right, he noticed amongst the thick trees, there was this little trail, this dirt trail that kind of wound off into the distance. And for some reason, Frank was just immediately drawn to it. And so he pulled on his horse's reins and came to a stop and just stared at this strange trail. Frank thought about how for all this time they'd been out here searching for gold, they'd basically only looked in this river and found nothing. And so he thought to himself, maybe the gold is not in the river, but it's maybe out there in the woods. And maybe this trail that he was looking at might lead them to gold. And so Frank turned back around to tell the rest of the group about his big idea, to try to go down this trail here. But when he looked, he saw all the men in the group, except for his best friend Blackjack, had continued on without him. They basically hadn't even stopped when Frank had stopped. However, Frank really didn't care that the group had left him because he was totally over this trip and frankly didn't want to be with this group anyways. And so he just looked over at Blackjack and just kind of gestured towards this trail as if to say, "You want to go this way?" And Blackjack, who was also totally over this trip, just smiled and nodded like, "Yeah, let's go." And so the two men turned their horses and began heading down this thin dirt trail off into the woods. For several hours, Frank and Blackjack continued on this trail deeper and deeper into the forest. You get a picture of very thick trees all around, and it's just this little winding dirt trail on the ground. They had no idea where this trail was going, but there was just something so powerful about this trail. It was like calling them to go. But as they rode along, Frank kept getting this bad feeling. Like he kept hearing what sounded like voices and footsteps right behind them on the trail. But every time he turned, all he saw was Blackjack. There was nobody around them at all. They were deep in the forest. And after a while, Frank kept hearing these noises and he asked Blackjack, like, "Hey, are you hearing that stuff too?" And Blackjack said, "Yeah, I am." But he too would turn around and see nothing. They were all alone. And so eventually, the men convinced themselves that, what those sounds must be is the sound of their party, who's discovered they have, left the group and maybe they're out there looking for them. But Frank and Blackjack really had no intention of rejoining the group. They kind of didn't like the group. And so they said, "You know what, let's just keep on going." Eventually, the path these two friends were on led them to a stream. And so they stopped, they got off their horses, they knelt down, and they scooped their canteens into the water to get a drink. And as Frank did that, he looked into the crystal clear water and he saw nuggets of gold just sitting there in the stream. Frank couldn't believe it. I mean, he's out here looking for gold, but he was not expecting to find it right here in the middle of nowhere, despite, his instinct that maybe the gold was out here. And so he just froze and he's staring at this. He can't believe it. He grabs Blackjack, who hadn't seen it yet, and pulls him over. Blackjack looks, and the two men, they're like, oh my goodness, we've done it. But Frank said, look, before we celebrate, let's see what we're dealing with here. Let's go upstream here and try to find the source of this gold. And so the two men, they got up, they're super excited. They start walking along the side of the stream, looking in the water. And as they're moving upstream, they're seeing all this gold in the water, and it's getting more and more. And eventually they reach this rock ledge the water was pouring over down into the stream. And literally in the ledge are these massive veins of gold. They had found a gigantic gold mine that clearly nobody else had tapped before. I mean, this could be worth not just millions of dollars, but billions of dollars. And so at this point, the two friends began to celebrate. They were ecstatic. I mean, this is unbelievable. They're jumping around, they're hugging each other. And then at some point, they just kind of stopped and went silent because they realized they now had a big dilemma. So the whole reason Frank and Blackjack were out here in the Canadian wilderness was to look for gold, but they were looking for gold on behalf of the rich investor, Lafayette French, which meant they were contractually obligated to tell French if they found gold. And so here they are, they've found this massive gold mine, and that's what they're supposed to do, again, based on their contract. But if they did that, French would get rich beyond his wildest dreams from this mine. And yeah, he'd cut them a check, a piece of the profits, but it would be like nothing compared to what French would get from this gold mine. Or, and this is where the dilemma comes in, Frank and Blackjack could hide the fact that they had found this mine, and then they alone could come out here anytime they wanted, take the gold, and become rich themselves. Now, granted, they would have to be kind of subtle about it, because if they started showing up with barrelfuls of gold, Lafayette French is going to find out about it and they're going to be in trouble. But, there was a way to do it where this mine could effectively be theirs and they could get rich. But obviously, there was a lot of risk involved in that second choice. And so Frank and Blackjack decided that, this is way too big of a decision for us to make just on the fly right now. So let's just stay here in the area, let's camp out for the night and just sleep on this and come to a decision tomorrow. So the two men left the stream and headed over to this clearing that was right nearby and decided that's where they would pitch their camp for the night. Blackjack left to go gather firewood, and Frank began to pitch their tent. And as Frank did that, as he began setting up their tent, he began hearing whispers, kind of like the voices he was hearing as they were walking in on that trail, and they kept thinking it was maybe the group that was looking for them. He began hearing those voices again. It was kind of all around him in the trees, but every time he looked, there was no one there. Now, Frank convinced himself that maybe these whispers were actually Blackjack because he had gone off to get firewood and maybe it was him. But at one point when Frank heard these whispers, he looked in the direction of the whispers. There was no one there. And he realized Blackjack was at the same time on the opposite side of the clearing. It could not have been him. And so Frank couldn't help but feel really unsettled. It was like there was somebody or something here watching them or listening to them, but he just couldn't tell who or what it was. But Frank just told himself to shake it off, don't worry about that. Instead, just focus on getting the camp set up. A few hours later, Frank and Blackjack were sitting on a log in front of their campfire eating rations, talking about what they were going to do with the gold. At some point, Frank said what he was really thinking about this whole situation. He told Blackjack, look, I think we'd be so stupid to tell Lafayette French. Why should we take a small payday one time when we can basically have an endless supply of wealth for the rest of our lives? But when Frank looked over at Blackjack to see what his reaction was to this pitch, he could see right away that Blackjack disagreed. Blackjack was kind of looking down and he kind of turned to Frank and was like, look, it's morally wrong to lie here. I would rather be poor and honest than rich and morally bankrupt. And so what had started as a civil discussion from this point on really escalated and just became a full-blown yelling fight, with both men absolutely refusing to budge on their stance about what to do with this gold. And eventually, when the two men were standing up and just screaming in each other's faces, Blackjack finally just threw his hands up and said, you know what, enough. And he turned around and stormed over to the tent and disappeared inside. For a minute, Frank just stood there stewing by the fire, just completely furious that Blackjack didn't see it the way he saw it. But eventually, Frank kind of calmed down and thought, you know what, I need to go to bed too. Obviously, we are not near a decision. We need to sleep on this. And so, even though Frank was still upset, he walked over to the tent too, didn't say a word to Blackjack. He just climbed inside, got into his sleeping bag, and tried to go to sleep. But after laying there for a while, when Frank had not fallen asleep, and his friend Blackjack had, he was snoring and passed out, Frank just could not help feeling enraged again at his friend. Like, how can you not see this opportunity here? Why in the world would you tell Lafayette French? That's so stupid. And so Frank just laid there restlessly, tossing and turning, listening to the sound of Blackjack snoring and getting so mad at him. And as he did, Frank went from, I need to convince Blackjack in the morning that we need to keep the gold for ourselves, to, I need to stop Blackjack from telling anyone. He is an obstacle. He's not a friend. He's a problem. And as he thought about this, these dark thought loops were going through his head. Frank just became consumed with rage. It was like he couldn't control what he was doing. And in that moment, Frank found himself getting up, walking out of the tent, and grabbing an axe. And before he could even think about it, he had walked back into the tent, raised the axe, and driven it into Blackjack's skull, killing him instantly. A few minutes later, Frank was outside sitting by the campfire looking at his bloody hands, wondering what just happened. How could he have just done what he did? That was his best friend. What had come over him? It was like Frank was a different person. He couldn't understand. But as Frank was sitting there grappling with what he had just done, a twig suddenly snapped over in the direction of the tent. And instantly Frank looked over, like, who's over there? What's going on? And as he looked in the direction of the tent, he began to hear this low, guttural moaning. It almost sounded like a dying animal. And he thought for a second, like, wait a minute, is Blackjack not actually dead? Is that him making that noise? But at the same time, Frank's thinking, that's not possible. I practically split Blackjack's head in half with that axe. He can't be making that sound. But before Frank could even begin to process what he was hearing, this sound, this moaning sound, got louder and it got closer to Frank, like it was moving in his direction, but there's nobody here. And so Frank is horrified, and then right as the sound is practically on top of him, he began hearing those whispers, those voices he had been hearing in the woods on the way out here. Except this time the voices were clear. They were talking to Frank, and they were saying, you're gonna be tortured for what you did to Blackjack. And then just as soon as these voices began, suddenly they stopped. The moaning stopped, and the entire forest just went deadly silent. And Frank is just stuck there staring in the tent, wondering what's happening. And then the silence was broken by this unbelievably loud, high-pitched, blood-curdling human scream coming from the tent. And it was at that point that Frank just got up and sprinted to his horse and began riding away from the gold, his friend's body, everything. He didn't care. He needed to get out of there as soon as possible. But the second he began blindly galloping through the forest away from this area, he began hearing whispers and heavy footsteps right behind him as if they were following him out of the forest. But Frank was so scared, he didn't even dare turn around to look. He just rode as fast as he possibly could. Hours later, Frank suddenly emerged from the dark forest, and just by absolute happenstance, he arrived right in the town that he and the other gold prospectors had passed through on their way out into the woods. And the moment Frank left the tree line and actually entered into this town, the whispering and the footsteps, which had basically chased him all the way to this point, they stopped. Suddenly, Frank was all alone. Now, by this point, Frank had convinced himself that everything he had heard in the woods, the voice telling him he was going to be tortured for what he'd done, the heavy footsteps, the whispering, the screaming, the moaning, all of it, everything that had caused him to flee was actually the ghost of Blackjack. That after he had killed his friend's spirit had immediately risen and sought revenge on Frank. That's what was happening. And this horrified Frank so much that he didn't care at all about the gold anymore. He just wanted to get out of the spiritual danger he thought he was in. And so as he rode into this village, all he looked for was a church. And when he found the church, he went to the front steps and he sat there waiting for the priest. At dawn, the priest finally arrived at the church and found Frank sitting there looking horrible, and Frank instantly stood up, rushed over to the priest, and began begging him to save him from Blackjack's ghost. Now, at first, as the priest listened to Frank tell his story about this ghost, he just thought that Frank was crazy. But once he got Frank to slow down and sort of go over the details step by step, the priest realized that perhaps there was some truth to this story. It sounded like it was probably true that Frank really did find a gold mine with his friend named Blackjack, and at some point, the discovery of this gold mine prompted Frank to murder Blackjack. But despite the fact that this man, Frank, had just openly confessed to a murder, the priest could only focus on the gold that apparently Frank had found out in the forest. It was like this intense feeling had come over the priest, this darkness that just made him suddenly so greedy. He had never felt this way before in his life, but it was like he was laser focused on finding a way to claim that wealth that was just out there right now. And so against all his better judgment, the priest turns to Frank and says, "You know what? We'll help you. But for right now, you need to get out of town. Get out of here. Don't come back. We'll go out, we'll find Blackjack, we'll give him a proper burial, and that will protect you from his ghost." And so Frank was so thankful to the priest and he took off, not realizing that the priest did not care at all about Frank at this point. All the priest cared about was getting Frank out of the picture so that that gold mine out in the woods could be his. The next day, the priest asked his friend, an outdoorsman named John McDougall, to head off into the wilderness to try to find Frank and Blackjack's campsite. And so that's what John did, and after a few hours of looking, he found the campsite. And sure enough, he found Blackjack's dead body still inside of the tent with the axe lodged in his head. And right away, John, the ever-loyal friend to the priest, began doing what the priest told him to do, which was to bury Blackjack to cover up the murder. Because the priest and John were planning to claim this gold mine for themselves, and they couldn't have this murder getting out to the public, because then officials would come out and investigate the scene, and then they would find the gold mine. They couldn't have that. And so John began digging a grave for Blackjack, and as he did, he began hearing whispers all around him in the trees. Remember, he's all alone out there. And so he began looking around, trying to figure out who's out here. Did somebody follow him? But there was no one. John did his best to keep trying to dig as quickly as he could, but these whispers, these awful voices, they just kept getting louder and louder and more pronounced and closer to him, eventually to the point where John was spooked. I mean, John was this avid outdoorsman who routinely spent time by himself out in the wild, but here he was feeling very unsettled by these voices. But despite his fear, John did what he was told and dug the grave as fast as he could, grabbed Blackjack's body, threw him inside, he covered him up, and he put a couple of big stones on top of the gravesite to kind of make a makeshift tombstone. And then afterwards, again, despite feeling totally unsettled out here, John did the next part of the plan, which was to go look for gold, go to the stream, find the gold these guys were talking about. But as John is down by the water looking for gold, he began hearing more and more of those voices all around him. He kept spinning around, but nobody was there. And then finally, this awful high-pitched laughter cut through the trees. He whipped around, there was nobody there, but it was so terrifying that John just abandoned the search for gold and just hopped back on his horse and fled out of there. But within a couple of days, John and the priest had convinced themselves that those weird noises and that laughter that John had heard out there was just some bird, that it was all in John's head, he was spooked for no reason. When in reality, it was just that incredible pull of that gold being out there waiting to be claimed. It was like John and the priest, they couldn't not go looking for it. And so John decided to go back out into the woods, except this time he did not go alone. He brought a group of men with him. And so this group, led by John, retraced Frank and Blackjack's steps down that skinny trail all the way to their campsite. And when they got there, John just froze. He could not believe what he was seeing. The rocks that were sitting on the grave where John had just buried Blackjack were gone. These huge rocks just missing. And also, the tent, the bloodied tent where Blackjack had been murdered, had also been cleared. There was no trace of it anywhere. It was like the campsite had never existed. And this made no sense to John because he knows this is a totally isolated part of the wilderness. Like, nobody comes through here. Who in their right mind would just happen to pass by and randomly grab all these rocks and the tent covered in blood and take it out of here? It made no sense. Like, who could have done this? Now, until this point, John really had convinced himself that everything he'd experienced the time before was in his head. It was just a bird or, it was just normal forest sounds. And he also, like the priest, had convinced himself that Frank's original story about Blackjack's ghost chasing him out of the forest was just the ramblings of a crazy, guilty man. A murderer's guilty conscience had created that story. But now, as John was surveying the scene in front of him, he couldn't help but think,
maybe this place is haunted. And so once again, John just turned and fled. He and the men, they got out of there as fast as they could, and when John got back to town, instead of going to the priest, he just went right to the bar and just started drinking. And he kept on drinking until he died of alcohol poisoning just a couple of days later. And John's death started a chain of unexplained catastrophes, all connected to this gold. First, the priest, after discovering what happened to John, didn't really spend any time grieving the loss of his friend. Instead, the priest just saddled up and headed out into the woods to find the gold himself. However, he found the trail that led out to the campsite and to the gold had been destroyed in a forest fire. Then, Lafayette French, the rich investor who had bankrolled the original expedition, he heard about the mine and decided he would go find it. However, the guide that he hired to take him there literally died on the way into the forest. By this point, French had heard all the stories about how, Blackjack's ghost was out in this forest haunting the area, preventing people from finding the gold. But French ignored all those stories. Just like with Frank and the priest and John, it was like that gold had an unbreakable hold on him. And so for 30 years, French kept going out into that forest, searching for that gold mine, and eventually he found it. Or at least that's what he said in the last letter he wrote back home. But we'll never actually know for sure, because after sending that letter, on that same day, Lafayette's cabin burned down and he died, without telling anybody the location of the mine. And so with French's death, that sort of solidified the rumors that the haunting was real. And people began to believe that there was only one thing that could explain this almost magnetic pull the gold had on so many people, and also all the terrible fates that befell everybody who tried to go look for it. And that was that the gold mine was cursed. And today, people still believe that Blackjack's ghost is out there in the forest preventing people from finding the gold. But whatever the truth is, whether the curse is real or not, to this day, no one has ever been able to successfully find the gold again and live to tell about it.
Yeah, the kind. You said my name like it was safe to stay. Soft tone hiding what you take away. Your smile felt warm, your silence was cold. I learned your truth and the things you didn't hold. I read your eyes like a warning sign. Still cross the line every single time. You touch my scars like you knew the code. Then blame my heart for the weight you broke. I called it love, it felt like gravity pulling me down, but it felt like destiny. I knew the damage still stayed inside. Mistook your chaos for being alive.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille